Oh, and welcome to the Rubber Duck Dev Show. It's finally Halloween month, and we are going to do some scary things, like talk about should you put comments in your code. Yeah.
I think that we've talked about much more scary things.
Yeah, probably, like date time. Anyway, I'm Chris.
I'm Creston.
And tonight we answer the question, should you comment your code? But first, what'd you do this week?
So did some refactoring in my payment gateway implementations in my application. So basically it speaks to a couple of different payment gateways based upon what customers want. Just did some refactoring for a particular one. On the consulting front, I helping a client try to figure out how to downsize the server they're using for their database, trying to implement that and find a way for them to do that. Discussed some schema changes for another client that could help them increase the throughput of their how they were using the table. So for example, they had like a big JSON field they were storing a lot of information in, and it's having an impact on transactional throughput. And so basically, if you remove some of that and put it in their own columns because of how it would get updated, basically they put a lot of information in a single row. And if you need to update, we're using the JSON B field that's available, the JSON data type that's available.
Yeah.
So I said, well, if you actually broke this out into multiple rows, now there's disadvantages to that, because now you have to, if you're going to select something, if you have all your data in one row, you're going to select it super fast. But it's going to be harder to say update that field, because again, with Postgres, when you do an update, it actually creates a second row. And if you do another update, it creates another row. This is all internally. You don't see these rows, but the reason they do it is for visibility of anyone else connected to the system. That's its, concurrency control. It just maintains those other rows. So if you're updating a lot, because you have a lot of data in this JSON B field, you're going to get, a lot of rows generated, and you could potentially hit locking issues of multiple things you're trying to update it at once. If you have a lot of data in one row that needs to be updated here or there, you're going to potentially have lock contention. But if you break it up into multiple, and then, if you're storing any kind of history in there, like, for example, do things by date, then that one row, if for all time, is going to constantly be updated. Whereas if you're able to break it down to different rows, say by time period, like per year, well, now if you're in the current year, that's the only row that's going to be updated. You don't have to touch all that other data in the table when you do an update.
Right.
Those are independent rows and won't be touched. So you're minimizing the amount of data you have to move around, and the size of the rows will be smaller. So basically talking through refactoring the schema to make, things more efficient from a update perspective. But as I said, it would take a slight hit on the query perspective, because not everything's going to be in one row anymore.
Yep.
So that's one thing. The other thing is helped a client with just some query optimizations of how best to pull data out of a database given a particular schema. So that's a lot of stuff I worked on recently.
Yeah, this week I have mostly been playing tech support guy for our biggest client. It's been one of those weeks where I just can't get away from the support tickets long enough to do a whole lot of programming. They're having a big rollout, so I kind of expected that to happen. But
so is this like it's like part of your job description to do like support, so it's not like pure develop, or is it like programmer support, or what?
No, we have a support team, frontline support,
right
that'll escalate if it gets to a point where somebody needs to be looking at code or a database or back end stuff. because they can't figure out what the deal is. So I was just doing a lot of log sniffing and network
So
sniffing.
trying to figure out it's really bug tracing, I guess.
And to a point, but it's some of it's a big chunk of it is PEBCAC problems. Problem exists between chair and keyboard.
Okay.
On the other end, the client just doing goofy things and, not. And to be fair, there are some things, clients will do goofy things, but if they're consistently doing those, you should modify your program so that they can't do those anymore.
Yeah, they're doing something that the system wasn't designed to do, perhaps, maybe.
Yeah. Using all the undocumented features.
Yeah.
So, there are some things that came out of that, and that's really kind of what this stuff is for. It's kind of a pilot to work out all the little kinks and stuff on both ends. Hey, you need some more training on this. Hey, we need to tighten up this bit of code because you keep dorking it up and we didn't put enough safety nets in, and those kind of things. But
it sounds like an article I read recently where someone was talking about they were working at Stripe, the payments company, and their API in a lot of different areas had no bounds checking. So basically people could put unlimited amounts of data in certain parts of the API. So suddenly they started running into all these problems, and basically they're saying, okay, we need to put some reasonable limits in. And once they defined what those reasonable limits were, there were still, I think, hundreds plus customers that still exceeded those. So they had to come up with exceptions,
Oh my
so
gosh.
The takeaway was, if you have no limits or don't take into account, your customers will find those limits and exploit them.
Yes, for sure. And we have that a lot too. I mean, we're not only was the code having to be evaluated and rethought in some bits, but also our server architecture had to, because we had anticipated this will be plenty. Turns out they decided that they needed a lot more. But
Yep.
that's what testing is for. So anyway, all right, kids, question of the week. When do you comment your code? We're going to be answering some of those questions for us tonight. We're going to talk about some things that we found out in the community, their feedback on it, and there are probably going to be a lot of opinion differences, because I read some of the link that Creston put up for one of these articles, and I was going, nah, I don't agree with that. That's okay, but no, I don't agree with that. So we may have some, and commenting your code is a very opinionated subject anyway. It's entirely subjective. So it's every programmer I've run into has a little bit different opinion on, from never comment your code to comment every line of code. Don't do that, and everything in between. So it's a little goofy sometimes, but anyway, we'll get into it. But first, let's have a look-see at the live chat. Hey, Andrew. You do it when there isn't a better alternative. Well, when is that? There's always an alternative. What is a better alternative? So I'll let you start this one. Otherwise, I'll get on a soapbox and never shut up.
All right. Well, I mean, so I'll first mention when I started programming, there was, and this was, of course, decades ago, there was an emphasis on you should comment your code. But, it's kind of like, I always kind of felt guilty, kind of the way probably not doing enough test coverage or whatever, that same kind of guilt, because I never did a lot of commenting on my code. And now my viewpoint has evolved to um, probably the fewer comments, the better. And for a number of reasons for that. Um, so my opinion is that in a lot of cases, comments just duplicates what your code is already doing, or you're trying to explain what the code does. And it's more advantageous to write the code that kind of conveys what it does. Now, I think one of the posts that I included, like don't use comments, use code, has a lot of different techniques that you can use to kind of do that, like doing a good job naming methods, naming variables, things of that nature, maybe using constants in certain cases. I think those, doing the naming right, helps eliminate a lot of comments.
Well, and that's a good point. I mean, one of the things that drives me nuts as a programmer, if I go into somebody else's code and I see like PT equals or A equals, or what is that? I mean, if you're
and don't explain it. And the point
Yeah.
is, don't explain it by putting a comment. Actually, don't name
Yeah.
it that. Name it what it is.
Right. Just, I mean,
is P a partition? Is R a room? You know, what is it?
right. And it's not, we're not writing in COBOL anymore. Those extra few characters on a variable name don't matter from a space standpoint, but they really do matter from a code readability standpoint.
Yep.
So knock that crap off. Just don't do it.
And the thing about it is that you're essentially doubling, depending on how many comments you add, you're essentially doubling your code. So you're describing the code, and then you write the code. And then if you're actually doing tests, now you're essentially doing everything in triplicate. So, which
we're back to the old carbon copy forms.
Yeah, I can't fathom that. So, I mean, so basically that means incorporating comments have a maintainability cost, because if you go in and change that code, well, now your comments have to change and your tests have to change. So essentially it's a triplicate situation.
Right.
If it's not a refactor. If it's a refactor, essentially you shouldn't change. Maybe you change the underlying how it works, but if it does the same thing, if it's just a refactor, then you're not going to, probably maybe have to change the tests or whatnot, but still. So now, before I get into how you should, or my opinions on when you should comment your code, do you have any, get on your soapbox for a minute and get
well, let's see. All right. Strap in. Yeah, like I said, it's a very opinionated subject. So I'm very minimalist when it comes to comments. When I started my career, I wasn't, but you got to remember that that's almost 25 years ago, and programming languages were very different then. Ruby wasn't a thing, and C# wasn't a thing. Basic and COBOL and just bleh.
Heaven forbid assembler or whatever else.
Right. And there were also a lot of just bad habits that programmers had, and it wasn't easy to disseminate the information like it is today because we didn't have the internet. So, you learned how to code from the guy you worked with that coded his way, but you couldn't learn to code from the entire community of people. And I mean, a little more than just one other guy, but still, it was not like having the internet. So there was a lot more commenting going on. Now, in some programming languages, especially like C or COBOL or Fortran, things like that, you really needed comments because you just couldn't write descriptive code. It just wasn't a language feature. So, and And with some of those
And
languages,
there were also a lot of memory considerations. So,
right,
I'm sure they needed short variables and short
method names and
method names and all that kind of, yeah.
exactly. So
Everything had a very high cost. So
right.
being terse, there were advantages to that.
So it's not like this habit of commenting code came out of nowhere. There did used to be a reason for it. There's not that much of a reason for it anymore. Now, there are places where you must comment your code, and we'll talk about some of those. But in general, if your internal code needs a lot of comments, you're just writing your code wrong. With any modern language that I've ever come across now, if you have to do that, you probably didn't do it right.
Yep.
So I'm gonna cut my soapbox short, or we're gonna have a 4-hour show here. So go ahead.
All right. So some reasons to comment your code, or these are my top line, is that if you have essentially public methods that other people are going to be consuming, where they're not necessarily, and I'm going to add this caveat, where they're not necessarily drilling into the implementation. Now, the reason I'm saying that is because think of it kind of like an API. So if you have a module or something that someone is going to consume, it's advantageous to have the comments there to understand, okay, how am I going to implement this piece of code, this library, without having to dig into understanding how it does what it does. So I think there comments are important. So you can just say, okay, here it is. How do I use this without having to understand the implementation? Now, I have a question for you here, because like for my own internal projects that aren't like externally produced code, I don't follow that guiding principle because other developers working on it presumably have access to the implementation or whatnot. So like if I was doing a project that's out in public, I would document / comment more than I do for code that's going to be kept in-house, for example.
Oh, for sure. I mean, my thing is any publicly available API must be documented. If somebody besides the company that's writing that code is going to access that bit of code, that needs to be documented. Your endpoints, any of the public methods that you use as an API to let somebody, some other company or some other entity access into this program. Or if they're the connection points, if you're doing like a SOA architecture and it's the connection points between the SOA, you need to document that, because 6 years from now, when some other junior programmer comes in and they're trying to figure that out, they're not going to have a chance if there's no documentation on those endpoints. So those kind of things, I think, must always be documented. Even the best code in the world at that place needs to be. Now, but and just because it's a public method, doesn't mean it needs to be documented. If it's a publicly available endpoint, I think is the kind of distinguishing factor for me.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if you have a programming team big enough where you actually have like a library team that gets down and dirty and they develop modules or libraries that other programmers need to consume, then I think commenting that essentially they become your public consumers of it.
Right.
So you need to document it.
Yeah, you can't have outside public consumers in the same company, because you're right. And we have some of that because our team is so large. We actually have different sections. We've got a front end section that, as I'm working on API and back end stuff, I have to document some of that because the other teams are going to need to interface with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've got a lot of public methods that my stuff is talking to each other with, my different objects, I don't document those because they're not kind of going outside of the scope of that project.
All right. And the other place where I do comments is if I feel I need to explain, certain aspects of implementation, or why did I take this path versus this. Like if I feel as if I'm taking, and this kind of gets where it gets wishy-washy. If I feel like I'm taking an esoteric path, because I'm sure every programmer is going to be feel different on that, I feel the need to explain kind of why I did what I did. So like if I ever have, I think I'm doing something kind of non-mainstream or kind of taking a detour, but there's a reason why I did it. Sometimes I will put in the comments, I'm doing this for this reason.
Right. And I've had to do that quite a bit in my career. There was one instance when I was doing plugin writing for PowerPoint and using .NET. There was a very significant bug that we had to write a workaround for, a bug in PowerPoint. And it literally took us about 5 months to finally track this down and figure out what the actual problem was.
Ouch.
And yeah, it was nasty. And so when we finally put the workaround in, we put a comment right in the code and says, this is why this code is here, because the code was just garbage. I mean, it was anybody coming out of there not knowing that this was to fix a specific problem would have erased the code. Even a junior programmer would have looked at that and gone, oh my God, what are these guys on drugs? What is going on? So we had to put a comment right there, said, don't delete this. This is here for this reason. Here's a link to the explanation of the problem from Microsoft, and here's why we're doing this crazy crap. So, and that's important.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess my perspective, which is a lot like a lot of others, I think at this point in time, is that, you need to rely on the clarity of your code, how you write it, as well as the tests instead of comments, because, you definitely need tests, and those should be your duplicate as opposed to the comments.
Yes.
So that's kind of my...
Yeah, there's one other place where I'll write comments in the code, internal code, and that's if I'm having to deal with company XYZ, client XYZ's weird business logic that doesn't really make sense in this context, but we're trying to deal with it. So I'll comment the code sometimes and say, we're doing this way because XYZ has this requirement.
Yeah, I'd still kind of, that's just my opinion, I'd still probably put that under the esoteric kind of decision, doing it for this reason, or explaining why you did something non-obvious, I guess.
Yeah, that's true. And it's only in those cases where, we're having to make a change to what makes sense in this context because of this one person or this one customer. So.
All right. Did you want to kind of look at the post that don't use comments, use code?
Yeah. Let's rip this apart. No. Most of this is pretty good. There are some things that I kind of disagree with, but comments are code smell. Okay. True in general. If I see a bunch of comments in code, the first thing I'm doing is looking at the code and going, is your code written so cryptically that I need comments, or is this comment here for a specific reason? Now, comments are code smell. If I'm looking at public API code, that goes out the window, that sentiment.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I would say, yeah, in most cases, I agree. Yeah.
So I'll let you drive this here, of course, because you have to.
Because I have to. I got the little mousy mouse. So yeah, I mean, describing the obvious, don't do that. We don't need lines like, hey, this create rooms creates rooms. Okay. I mean,
yeah, again, that's that duplication.
Yeah, don't waste your finger strength.
Yeah, and if you name things appropriately, that the point of this is that if you name things appropriately, you should be able to avoid any of these comments.
Right. And I can pretty much tell just by reading this line of code what this does. It's not cryptic. Creates a room 5 times. I don't need a comment for that. If he had 5 times this CR 1012, then you would need a comment, and the first thing I'd say to this coder would be, why are you naming things CR? Are you really that lazy? I mean, come on. Most languages now have code completion, so the first time you define that, you type the first couple of letters and just code complete. So let's, make the names meaningful. Just do it. Yeah, I mean, this is not hard. Magic numbers.
And this is basically conveying using constants instead of.
Yeah. Because one of the things that I ran into a lot of times in, especially in .NET, I don't know, it's not a problem with .NET. It's a problem with the community of .NET seems to be stuck on this. And that is, they use a lot of numeric indexing rather than constants and named things. So I would see a lot of .NET code that was just sprinkled with numbers all over the place, and that makes it really hard to read.
Yeah, that's odd.
Yeah, well, I mean, like you've got an enumerator that's, built with all these things, but they say enumerator 0 instead of what the enumerator, it's why? And it wasn't, it's not that .NET can't do that. They just, I don't know. I don't know if it's because that came out of Visual Basic, which came out of Basic, and it just kind of evolved along those lines. But it just seemed to be a stuck mindset for a lot of them. And I'm not trying to knock .NET programmers. I am one, but it's a weird thing that you just don't see in the Ruby world very much. Comments for measurement units. Yeah. This is kind of silly. Putting this 6 means 6 hours.
Well, you have to calculate in your head if you don't have a comment there. I mean, I've done exactly this. So I'm going to admit to that.
See, this is one of those times. No, I mean, it's not that big a comment. And if you're going to do stuff like this, please put it at the end of a line. Don't take up 3 or 4 lines of code space doing it. But I
mean, it's unnecessary, but
yeah,
I put it in there just for convenience when I went, whenever I would go back to it, I could just look at it without having to calculate anything. Now and the thing he proposes here is essentially adding additional methods to handle that. And I mean, I suppose you could, but I just never.
Well, I think that's a little much for adding methods too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
This just, I mean, maybe it's just me, but I could read 60 times 60 times 6. Seconds equals 60 times 60 times 6 and figure out that you're trying to get the seconds in 6 hours. That's not, so maybe this is just kind of a pedantic example. But yeah, because I think adding new methods for this particular thing is a little overblown as well. But I get the idea. And I agree. If you're having to do something like this and it's not this obvious what it is, then maybe you should have a method or a little function that has a name so you can say this is what I'm doing. Don't use comments to separate things. Oh, yes, thank you. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen this, especially in config files. There is a place for comments in config files. I appreciate comments in config files. However, using them as separators, section separators, is annoying. I hate that. Oh, I mean, just group the stuff that needs to be in a section together and leave an extra space or something. But comments are not separators.
And here, what he's proposing is basically putting in different modules,
Yeah,
namespaced modules to separate things out.
Right, which is actually a good pattern anyway. Not in the case of config files; those are a little different.
Yeah.
But yeah, the separator is the file, the class, the module that should only have stuff that's in that thing. Oh God, to-dos. I see this all over the place. Now, I'm all right. So here is something that I'm not entirely sure that I agree with. And it depends a lot on which language and which environment you're working with. Certain IDEs, like the Visual Basic, actually will automate a to-do list for you if you put specific to-do comments in. So that becomes a useful thing. If you're trying to just, kind of lay out some stuff, lay out a new feature, let's say. You've got a new section of code you're trying to lay out. You can put a bunch of to-dos in there and it generates a to-do list for you so that you can go back and start ticking those things off. In that kind of circumstance, you don't want to be opening tickets or putting stuff into a tracking system. That's just a huge waste of time. This is a lot easier. But don't leave them in there.
But those are to-dos for you to complete the implementation of something. It's not something that they're not to-dos you're gonna put in that you plan to get back to a month from now.
Maybe.
Right?
Depends on how big the implementation is. But also, I've seen some that I'm not sure I could disagree with because they were like to do this specific code needs to be refactored because this. But and again, this kind of depends on the system you're working in and the way you're doing project management, because in our case, how we're doing it at our company, we can't have a crap ton of little to-do tickets in our system. It would completely just bollocks our system up. So there's a conscious choice to kind of isolate these kind of little things here. Now we do say, try to take care of them as soon as possible. If I see to-dos in there that have been in there for a year, I'm asking questions. If it's so important to put a comment in, why aren't we doing something about it? But I'm not, don't overdo this, but I'm not sure I object to that on the whole. Don't add deprecation notes. Well, okay. I don't know that I've ever actually seen that.
Yeah,
but
I don't.
Sure, I concur. Don't add after update notes. What?
I think what he's saying is that if you're going to be upgrading to the next version of Rails, then you're going to need to change something about it. if you know ahead of time.
Oh, well, I mean, yeah, but okay. I'm not quite catching how that's a comment thing, but oh yes, don't use comments as backup. I'll do this a lot as I'm changing things or refactoring stuff. I'll comment out blocks of code and move parts of them and rearrange things, but I'll leave the original there. But I get rid of it before I push my code to um to the source control, because that's just nasty. If you're going to comment it out, if we're not using it anymore, get rid of it. If you need to see what happened, look at your commit history. Go back through your old versions of code.
Yeah, I still have a bad habit where, if I'm going to change the implementation of something, or I'm going to, I'll still leave the call commented out and I'll still leave it there. I mean, I know it's all in the Git history, and but at times I kind of leave it in there. Not that I'm saying it's a good practice. It's just, I'm just admitting to some things that I still do from time to time.
And I had a hard time breaking this habit, because you didn't used to have the ability to go back at old versions of code and stuff, unless you were
easily,
unless you were like zipping up your code version every, but that wasn't a reasonable way to do it. So 20 years ago, this was a good way to back up your code, but it's just not necessary anymore. The problem is it's a hard habit to get out of, because that's really easy to do. And then 2 weeks from now, if I have a problem with the new code, I can look back, well, what was this doing before? And it's right there, instead of going to GitHub and opening up the old code. But what I see, and I saw this a lot in the .NET, more so than in Ruby, is that I'll see code files that are 75% comment of old methods, and like 4 or 5 different versions of the same method over and over and over again.
Now, in that case, I mean, but what I do, yes, I do. What I do is, when I go back into that file, because of course I forget that I've done this, and I go back into this class file, and I see all this commented out code, say a month later, I go back into the file to add a new feature or to, make some sort of change. And I see, this 10 lines of commented out code. I'm like, well, clearly this is working, because my tests are still passing and there's no customer complaints. I get that stuff out of there. So there's no way I would end up with a point of, like you say, 75%
right
of the file is comments.
Yeah, and I think that happened because it was more of there was a bigger team. It wasn't a solo type thing.
Yeah, I know.
And it's because people say, well, this comment was commented out and left in there. I'm not going to touch it because I didn't comment it out. And then it just keeps, building from there.
Yeah, with bigger team sizes, I could see that would be a problem, because then people don't want to touch it because oh, they left it there for some, reason or whatever.
Right. And there's another reason not to do this too, if you're in a larger team size, especially if you're in a team that has to do PRs and stuff. It makes the PRs a lot more of a pain in the butt to review when you've got a lot of extra comments and stuff in there. It's nice to have your PRs as compact as they can be, because typically if you're doing PRs, somebody has to review them. And if it's a big, nasty list of stuff to review, they're going to just not be happy. I actually
never have a problem doing that, because I just because it, it just gives you the diff of what changed in the file. So
it does, but
well, yeah, but if you have all those comments, then if that's part of the diff, that does make it more of a nightmare.
Yeah, it gets bad. One little thing like this isn't too bad, but as soon as you allow this, then you start allowing 75 lines of it, and then it's nasty. So just, this is just again, opinionated and very dependent on your circumstance. If you're in a team, especially one that does PRs, don't do this. This causes confusion. with team members, and it causes more work in the PRs. If you are, you know, one or two, maybe three people, and you have very tight communication, and you can say, well, look, I'm going to comment this out. I'm leaving it here for 2 months to make sure we don't need to revert it. Okay. But yeah, be careful of this stuff if you're working in a team, because this gets really out of hand really fast. Oh, when comments are okay. Well, let's see what he says. Comments is documentation. Yeah, I mean, on public APIs, I completely agree with that. If you're doing that on private methods, I think you might need to reevaluate your methods. Potentially. There's always exceptions. I've run into methods where they documented it, and I looked at the code and said, yeah, I see no better way to write this and not document it. So that has happened a couple times, but generally, nah. Yeah, and the magic comment stuff, that's, I mean, in some languages, it's just necessary because they're compiler directives, or like in Ruby, there's the one that to freeze the strings and things like that. So yeah, it's fine. Yeah, and if you're doing comments for documentation like Yard or Postman or things like that, that's another thing to consider, but make sure you're doing them well, and keep in mind too that you have to maintain those comments just like you have to maintain your code. So because if you document stuff in comments, especially things that are auto-generated, and you go in and make a bunch of changes to your code over the years and you don't update those comments, your documentation is absolutely useless. You've just wasted all your time putting those comments in. And if it's for a public API, you're going to tick off the consumers of that because your documentation isn't going to match what it's doing. So just keep that in mind if you're going to do comment documentation. And when you have no other tool. Yeah, and this is kind of the thing that we were talking about before, where, hey, we have to do this weird code here because of some external thing that's going on. We need to explain what this is so that somebody doesn't come behind and get rid of this code because the code's so stupid that no rational person would do it, but we have to. So here's why.
Yep.
And the TLDL is don't use comments. Don't use comments probably as much as you are, but there are places where you definitely need to comment. So I don't know that I agree completely with just don't use comments. That needs to be kind of, I guess.
Use them sparingly.
Yeah. There are reasons to use comments. But in general, yeah.
But I thought this had some good alternatives for code to replace comments.
Yes, for sure. I mean, if your code is not readable, you're not going to, you shouldn't fix that with comments. You should fix it by getting good at coding, making readable code. So, I mean,
and we should mention this is from MatthiasRich.com. So that's where we got the post, and the link will be in the description below, of course.
Right. All right. Do we want to have a little fun and just at the end of the show here and just look at some of the funny comments that people have put up over the years?
This is a post from towardsdatascience.com where someone posted about another post on comments, But at the end, he had bonus funny comments that actually exist.
So Crested found this, and I haven't read any of these yet, so I'm kind of looking forward to a good laugh here.
So for our podcast users, shall I go ahead and read?
Yeah, go ahead, and I'll blow this up a
Dear
little bit.
maintainer, once you are done trying to optimize this routine and you have realized what a terrible mistake that was, please increment the following counter as a warning to the next guy. And it says total hours wasted here, 73. It says undeclared variable error on line 0. Okay.
Oh my gosh. Exception equals new exception. Something is really wrong. Throw up. Ha ha ha. So he's throwing an exception.
I dedicate, here's another one. I dedicate all this code, all my work to my wife, Darlene, who will have to support me and our 3 children and the dog once it gets released into the public.
Oh, no. Drunk. Fix later.
This is one of my favorites for the shorter ones. Magic. Here's the other another comment. Magic. Do not touch.
This next one I have wanted to put in code so many times because I've just had these disagreements where I'm like, this is a bad thing to do, but hey, you're the boss. They made me write it against my will. That's probably not the best thing to do, but.
And the last one here is public Boolean is dirty. Why do you always go out and return dirty?
That's funny.
So some of these are just, clever comments to add a little flavor to the code base, whereas others are just humorous.
Yeah. And I mean, have fun with your code. If I see comments like this, I won't gripe about them, about having a comment in there, because that's not because you're writing bad code and need to document it. That's because you're just
you need to have fun on a Tuesday.
Right. So go for those. That's fine. Give another programmer a laugh once in a while. We all love that. All right. So anyway, that's the show for tonight. It's kind of a little lighter one, but yeah, just make sure you're paying attention to your comments. Don't overdo it, but understand when they're necessary and when you should be writing better code, so that us old developers don't go and read your code and have a stroke, because that would suck. All right, hope you guys enjoyed that show. If you did, please go ahead and mash that like button, and don't forget to follow, subscribe, just mash all the buttons and ding all the bells so you know when we're going live and when we're putting new videos up and all that stuff. Next week, we will not have a show.
Oh no.
Oh no.